By midnight, the evening began to thin. The clatter of silverware softened, and the scent of roasted spices and fine wine faded into marble and velvet. Guests filtered toward the exits in clusters, their conversations quieter than usual, marked not by triumph but reflection. No one could quite articulate what had changed, but all felt it. The party had been a success by every measurable standard. And yet, no one left feeling superior. Near the main entrance, chauffeur stood ready, doors held open in anticipation. Guests, once confident and talkative, now moved with an air of self-consciousness. For the first time in memory, the weight of being seen seemed heavier than the thrill of seeing. Inside, Amira helped collect the final dishes. She moved with the same grace she always had, but the energy surrounding her had transformed. The kitchen staff, once indifferent, now watched her with quiet pride. Some offered her small nods of solidarity. Others simply stayed out of her way, not out of fear, but out of reverence. She was still wearing the same uniform, still holding the same tray, but everyone now knew it had never defined her. The Sheikh had left earlier, without spectacle. A black car, no entourage. No farewell to the hosts. Just a glance toward a mirror before he stepped into the night, as if to say, "The next word is yours." In the corner of the drawing room, the host and his wife sat in tense silence. He tapped his glass repeatedly, avoiding his guests' lingering gazes. "Did we make a mistake?" his wife whispered. "No," he muttered. "We just didn't see clearly." And that, perhaps, was the story of the evening. They had all looked, but only one had listened. They had all spoken, but only one had been heard. They had all assumed, but only one had understood. In a society built on hierarchy, the true disruption had not been the Sheikh's arrival, but the revelation of depth beneath perceived simplicity. And it had come not with fanfare, but with fluency, not through defiance, but through response. As the final lights dimmed and the estate began to rest, Amira stepped onto the back terrace. The night air was cool, the stars unbothered by the weight of human drama. She looked out over the quiet garden, her hands finally free. In that stillness, she allowed herself a breath, not because she had won anything. There had never been a competition, but because something had changed both within and around her. She had entered the night as a maid. She would wake up the same. But now, people knew her name. More importantly, they knew her mind. And most importantly, she knew her voice. Across the city, stories of the evening would spread, shifting with each telling. But one truth would remain consistent. When no one else could speak, the maid responded. And in doing so, she silenced the room, not with noise, but with understanding. That was the lesson. And not everyone would be brave enough to learn it. For all their wealth, for all the ceremony, no one in the room could remember what the event had originally been about. Not the charity auction, not the speech from the visiting diplomat, not even the private tasting of the rare Armenian cognac. Those details had dissolved into irrelevance. The room, once brimming with conversations seeking to outdo each other, now pulsed with a quieter force, observation. And at the center of that stillness stood Amira. She no longer needed to speak. Her silence had become declarative. It no longer implied invisibility. It radiated presence. Every move she made was watched not with suspicion, but with reluctant curiosity, even awe. She had not demanded the spotlight, but it followed her like a shadow that refused to detach. The guests began second-guessing themselves. Every smile offered her way came a beat too late. Every nod of respect felt overcompensated, like an apology dressed in etiquette. Conversation shifted to self-defense, cloaked in admiration. She's clearly educated. Maybe working here is just a temporary arrangement. Did you see how composed she was? There's something regal in her bearing. I wouldn't be surprised if she had some special connection to the Sheikh. They grasped for explanations that wouldn't force them to confront the truth, that they had misjudged her simply because she had not worn her worth like a badge. But one person said nothing. Sheikh safe. He remained where he was, dignified and unmoved. But his silence, too, had changed. It no longer felt distant. It felt expectant, as though he was giving the room time to adjust, to reflect, to recalibrate. It was the host who broke the rhythm next. He approached the mirror with a practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment? The Sheikh has requested a word in private." She studied him for a brief second, long enough to see the calculation behind his courtesy. Then she nodded. "Of course." As she walked past the guests, still carrying an empty tray, they stepped aside not because they were asked, but because something inside them told them they should. For the first time all night, no one mistook her uniform for her identity. In the corridor beyond the salon, the hush deepened. The lighting was softer, golden, flickering slightly from antique sconces along the stone walls. Sheikh's safe stood near a wide column, his back to a tapestry, hands folded calmly in front of him. "Thank you for coming," he said, still in Arabic. Amira replied in the same tongue. "I didn't expect a second conversation." "Nor did I," he said. "But people often think silence is emptiness. Tonight, you showed them it is not." She lowered her gaze, a gesture of respect, though not submission. "You spoke to a room expecting only admiration. I answered because I heard sincerity." He nodded. "That is rare, and it carries weight." Then came a pause, a space not awkward but intentional. "I would like to offer you something," he said at last. Amira looked up, startled, not by the offer itself, but by the way he said it. Not as a benefactor offering charity, but as a man extending an opportunity to an equal. "You do not belong in the shadows of this house," he continued. "There are schools in Abu Dhabi, diplomatic programs, cultural initiatives. I can help you step into a world where your voice is needed." Amira inhaled slowly. "You assume I wish to leave." "I do not assume," the Sheikh said gently. "I only recognize potential that should not be kept behind curtains." She considered this, not out of hesitation, but because the decision mattered. It wasn't the offer she had expected, nor was it a gift. It was a doorway. "I will think about it," she said. "Good," he replied. A thoughtful answer is always more powerful than an eager one. They stood for a moment in silence. Two people who had crossed the invisible boundaries of class, title, and expectation through language alone. Then, with mutual nods, they parted. When Amira returned to the salon, no one dared meet her eyes directly, but they moved aside without being asked. They had not forgotten her voice, and they could not forget the silence that followed. The evening wore on, as all grand evenings do, with staged laughter, cautious networking, and clinking glasses raised more out of habit than celebration. Yet, beneath the practiced surface, something undeniable had shifted. The room no longer revolved around the hosts, nor the guest list of dignitaries and aristocrats. Every orbit now traced back to the moment the maid had spoken, and at the center of that quiet revolution sat Sheikh Saif al-Maktoum. He had not moved much since the exchange. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable. He listened when addressed, nodded when required, but his gaze returned again and again to where Amira worked, moving from guest to guest with poise that no longer felt invisible. At one point, as dessert was being served, a rich saffron pudding dusted with pistachios. He raised his hand. Not high, not demanding. Just enough. Amira noticed instantly. She approached him without hesitation, tray still balanced in one hand. Before she could speak, the Sheikh addressed her softly in Arabic, his voice low, audible only to her. "You carry your language with grace," he said. "Who taught you?" Amira's reply came with equal softness, though her tone carried more than just courtesy. It carried memory. "My grandfather. He believed the tongue of a people is the door to their soul. He opened it for me." The Sheikh's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in thought. "And yet here you serve quietly." "Until someone needed to be heard," she replied. A pause stretched between them. The noise of the room faded behind the silence they shared, not tense, but weighted. "You understand the power of silence," he said. She nodded. "Because I've lived in it." That earned her a rare smile from the Sheikh, small but genuine. Not many people dared speak to him plainly. Fewer still managed to do so with humility and clarity at once. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but an invitation. Amira hesitated, not out of fear, but principle. "With respect, I'm still on duty." The Sheikh considered that for a moment, then inclined his head. You, sir, with dignity. That is rare in any role. Finish your work, then come speak with me again when you are ready. Amira offered a respectful bow of her head and stepped back. But something had crystallized in that brief exchange, a recognition not of roles, but of depth. He had seen something in her, and more importantly, he had acknowledged it, not with condescension, not with flattery, just truth. Back among the crowd, the ripple continued. A woman at the bar whispered to her friend, "Did you see him smile at her?" I think he offered her a seat. But why her? No one had an answer. They searched for one, fumbling through the usual filters. Beauty, lineage, privilege, but none applied. What had happened tonight didn't fit inside the boxes they knew, and that made it more unsettling than any scandal ever could. One man muttered under his breath, "A maid commanding the attention of a sheik. What is the world coming to?" But the truth was, the world wasn't coming to anything. It had always been this way. They had just never looked closely enough. In the far corner, Amira stood for a moment by the tall arched windows, the night outside stretching into shadows. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, a double image, Maid and something more. She didn't chase the second one. She didn't need to. She had answered when it mattered. And now, others were answering in kind. The room returned to motion, but the air still felt different. Thinner somehow, like altitude had shifted and no one had quite adjusted. Glasses clinked, but with less enthusiasm. Waiters floated through the space, refilling champagne flutes for guests too, distracted to drink. Even the musicians played quieter now, as if aware they were no longer the highlight of the evening. And Amira? She resumed her duties like nothing had changed. She moved through the crowd, silent and efficient, collecting empty plates and replacing them with fresh servings. But everywhere she went, eyes followed. Some watched with admiration, others with unease. The illusion of hierarchy had been pierced. And for people who had spent their lives wrapped in the comfort of assumed superiority, that rupture was not easy to ignore. In a quiet corner near the fireplace, two diplomats stood whispering. "She must have studied," one murmured. "That wasn't just basic Arabic. That was classical, refined. She even used respectful forms of address. Maybe she's not really a maid," the other replied, frowning. "Could be planted. A message, perhaps?" They weren't the only ones speculating. The guests had moved from admiration to defense, searching for explanations that allowed them to preserve their understanding of the world. After all, if a maid could rise in a moment and speak the language of power better than they could, what did that say about them? But Amira paid them no mind. She had not spoken to be seen. She had spoken because silence would have meant disrespect. Not to herself, but to the man who had addressed the room in sincerity and been met with confused glances. She had recognized that silence. It was the same one she had lived in most of her life. Later, in the back hallway behind the kitchen, she leaned against the tile wall and took a breath. Alone now, away from the perfume-clouded air and the curated voices of importance, she allowed herself a moment. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. She had felt no fear, but from the weight of presence. Not many people ever realized when a moment was larger than themselves. She had, and she had stepped into it. Behind her, the kitchen buzzed with its usual urgency. Dishes clattered, pans hissed, staff moved in choreographed chaos. But just outside that door, a new narrative was unfolding, one in which she was no longer background. Amira, she turned. It was Yasmin, another maid, eyes wide and voice hushed. "They're talking about you. Everyone, even the Sheikh. The head steward says he wants to speak with you after the event." Amira nodded, not with pride, but with a calm inevitability. She had not sought attention. She had answered a call. Nothing more. But she knew what Yasmin meant. Things had shifted. Quietly, yes, but definitively. She straightened and smoothed the fabric of her apron. "They're only talking because they weren't listening before," she said softly. "Now they've heard something they can't ignore." Yasmin blinked, unsure how to respond. Amira smiled gently. "Come on, there's still dessert to serve." And with that, She stepped back into the salon, not as the girl in the background, but as the one who had spoken when no one else could, the one who had understood, the one who had responded. And though the guests might try to return to their conversations, their wine, their polished egos, the truth remained. The most powerful voice in the room had come from the least expected place, and no amount of gold or title could silence that echo. The room did not recover quickly. Though the music resumed, a delicate blend of piano and strings, it now felt ornamental, like wallpaper behind a portrait that no longer needed decoration. Conversations returned in fragments, small talk about stocks, foreign property, and the weather in London. But each sentence fell flatter than the last, as if the soul of the evening had been quietly stolen away. In truth, it had. Sheikh's safe remained seated at the long walnut table, an untouched glass of mineral water before him. He had declined every offered drink with a simple shake of his head. His focus was elsewhere, still on the Maid. She moved with practiced grace, blending once more into her role. But her stillness when not serving betrayed something deeper. It wasn't fear or pride, it was awareness. She knew what she had done. She knew who she had become in their eyes. Her name, though few knew it, was Amira. She had worked in the household for nearly 5 years, arriving without fanfare and rarely speaking above necessity. To most, she was just the quiet one. But in that quiet lived memory, study, and discipline. She had learned Arabic in her village, not as a school requirement, but as a gift passed down from her grandfather, a retired schoolteacher who valued language as a key to dignity. She had never needed it in this job. Until now. And now, the entire room knew. Whispers returned, though hushed this time, laced with curiosity and veiled embarrassment. Did you know she spoke Arabic? No, not a word. Fluent. I mean fluent. What did the Sheikh say exactly? But no one dared ask Amira directly. Instead, they watched her from a polite distance, as if proximity might somehow reveal the meaning behind the moment. She, in turn, gave them nothing. Her face remained neutral, her movements precise. Still, something subtle had shifted in her posture. Her spine a touch straighter, her silence now chosen, not inherited. The host, an aging man whose influence lay mostly in inherited wealth, tried to reclaim control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising a glass in false cheer, "a rare and distinguished honor to welcome Sheikh Saif Al Maktoum this evening. We hope our hospitality rises to meet the occasion." There were smiles, applause, but it was performative and everyone knew it. The Sheikh gave a small nod, neither pleased nor dismissive. He didn't need to speak. He had already said enough. Then, unexpectedly, he gestured once again to Amira. The host hesitated, his expression faltering. Would you like to address the room through her, Your Excellency?" The Sheikh offered no reply, only waited. And so, for the second time that evening, Amira stepped into a silence that wasn't hers and filled it. Standing near the table, she translated. Her voice was steady, precise. The Sheikh spoke softly in Arabic, and Amira relayed each phrase in perfect English, not as a servant parroting commands, but as a vessel for meaning. The Sheikh spoke of gratitude for the invitation, of respect for the gathering, and then, most notably, he offered praise. Praise for the value of language. Praise for those who listen when others assume they cannot. Praise for the invisible among the elite. The words, though elegantly phrased, struck like quiet thunder. Amira's eyes did not flicker as she spoke. She stood not beside the Sheikh, but a few respectful paces behind, never claiming his power, only carrying his message. Yet every person in the room heard only her. When the translation ended, the room remained hushed. The applause that followed came late, scattered and uncertain. It was clear no one knew what they were clapping for, the Sheikh or the woman who had given him a voice. Amira bowed slightly and returned to her place. She said nothing more, but nothing more needed saying. The marble floor of the estate's grand salon shimmered beneath the golden glow of chandeliers. Laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed across the room, where finely dressed guests moved with the practiced ease of people long used to privilege. It was a celebration of success, of lineage, of wealth. Yet beneath the silk and perfume, a low hum of anticipation stirred. Whispers had begun circulating earlier that day. A guest of unusual stature would be arriving. Not just a guest, the guest. At precisely 9 o'clock, the doors opened. A tall figure entered, draped in flowing white robes, a silk gutra falling neatly over his shoulders. He walked without haste, but with an unmissable authority. His skin was sun-warmed bronze, and his beard, precisely trimmed, spoke of a man who valued discipline. No introductions were made. None were necessary. His reputation had arrived long before he had. Sheikh Saif al-Maktoum, the oil magnate whispered to own a private fleet and a personal island, crossed the threshold without a glance at the murmuring crowd. His eyes, sharp as desert hawks, scanned the room once, then settled, not on the hosts, not on the high-ranking guests, but somewhere farther off, where a figure barely noticeable lingered in the shadows with a silver tray in hand. The chatter dulled. Conversation stuttered, paused, then fell into a hush. Sheikh Saif raised a hand, not in greeting but in quiet command. When he spoke, his voice was low, fluid, and firm, Arabic, the formal tongue, untouched by apology or translation. His words came like the slow chime of a clock striking midnight, elegant and inevitable, but none among the guests responded. A pause, long, uncomfortable. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, some offering polite smiles, others trying to guess at the meaning behind his words. The host cleared his throat, gesturing vaguely to the interpreter who hadn't arrived. The sheik remained silent, his gaze steady, unwavering. And then a voice answered him, clear, composed, also in Arabic. Heads turned in unison toward the far side of the room. There stood a maid, not young, but not old either, with dark eyes and quiet strength in her posture. Her uniform was modest, her hair tied back neatly beneath a simple scarf. She hadn't stepped forward. She hadn't needed to. Her voice alone had reached him. The sheik looked at her, almost amused. Then he nodded, slowly once. A conversation began, quiet but unmistakable, rippling to the tense air like wind through dry leaves. It wasn't just that she understood him. It was the way she spoke, measured, respectful, but not servile. The maid answered him as one who understood the gravity of words. Around them, the crowd stood stunned. The maid who had, moments earlier, been invisible had now become the room's undeniable center. And the sheik? He smiled just slightly. Not a performance, not for show. It was a private acknowledgement between two people who spoke a language far deeper than mere words. When their brief exchange ended, the sheik turned away from the rest of the crowd and gestured toward the maid as if indicating she would serve as his voice tonight. No one dared object. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was reverent. And in that stillness, one truth settled over the room like dust in sunlight. None of their wealth, status, or influence had prepared them for this moment. The power had shifted, and it had done so quietly. By the time the room exhaled again, the sheik had seated himself. The party resumed, softly, uncertainly, but nothing was quite the same. The maid returned to her place in the corner, but she was no longer just a help. She was the only one who had spoken, and the only one who had been heard.